So you've got a new Mac and you want to see what it can do, like me. As an animator, I do most of my work in Maya, but I'm moving into using Blender quite a bit as well. So I really wanted to see what it could do. So this is my configuration. I've got a 16-inch MacBook Pro M1 Max 32-core GPU and 64 gig of RAM. So I've got a number of different tests that I wanted to have a look at and see what Blender can do, from animation to bringing Alembic files, seeing what playback of Eevee specific files would be like in the viewports, and then also looking to some of the things that I haven't done before, but also geometry nodes, sculpting, modeling, simulations, some grease pencil, and then looking at some crowd favorites with some cycles, demo files, and some splash screen demo files from the Blender site. Possibly get into looking at some heavy instance files, and then a couple of other files that I've got kicking around. So let's start off. So the first things I've got is the Rain restaurant scene, and I'm going to open this up in Blender 2.93.5 LTS. Cool. So we've got the Blender Rain restaurant scene with the Rain rig from the Blender Studio. I'll put some links in the description below if you want to have a look at that. But this has already been pre-animated, and what I wanted to have a look at specifically as an animator is what is the playback speed like in the viewport? How do I need to have it in viewport shading all the time to be able to get a reasonable playback speed, or can I use it in Eevee? Let's just see what it's like. But first of all, let's just do the pass per 2 so I can actually see a bit better. And then we'll come back and zoom in. Cool. And we'll go back to the beginning.
Hey there, ladies. Hi, my name is Amy, and I'll be your waitress today. Is there anything I can get you to drink while you're looking at the menus? Hey there, ladies. Hi, my name is Amy, and I'll be your waitress today.
So as you can see, I've got the frames per second counter up in the top left-hand corner, and it's rock solid at 24, which is really good. Let's now have a look and change it to Eevee. Getting about 11, possibly 12. It's not too bad, but you wouldn't generally be animating in Eevee viewport. And just because we can, let's have a look at material preview. Getting about 15, that's not too bad. Not brilliant. But the majority of the time you're going to be animating in viewport shading and getting very smooth animation, which is great. And then if we split the view, into Eevee, see how we're doing. Okay, that's not too bad. You're about 18 with Eevee and viewport shading. I wonder if we can adjust this slightly. We got simplify on. Okay, so simplify is on. I'm going to set one subdivision. So let's change the subdivision and see if that makes a difference. Okay, not so much there, but if we join the areas here, switch back, getting a bit less. Let's try this. Let's go back to Eevee. And then if we turn off all these, keep simplify on. So we've got no motion blur, no bloom, ambient occlusion, screen space reflections. There we go. Hey, that's not too bad. It's just nipping at the heels of 24 frames per second. That's pretty usable. Nice. Yeah, this is cool. Such a lovely scene as well. Great. Okay. let's also have a look at changing the screen size. So just as a I've got the more space option set in my display, which is pretty high resolution, 3400 by 2200. What I wanted to have a look at by reducing the frame size of Blender, less pixels to render. So let's see if that makes a difference. Okay, that's not too bad. It's hitting 24 more often than it was before. If we then join these, go back. Okay, so it's pretty much on 24 in Eevee with Simplify on with no subdivisions and everything else turned on, everything else turned off, sorry, but with a smaller frame size. Then let's also have a look at changing the refresh rate of the display. So I've got ProMotion on, which is 120 Hertz, which is great for general everyday usage. But let's wonder if it's over and see if that makes a difference. It's pretty solid. It's hitting 25 a couple of times, then nipping underneath. That's great. And obviously with viewport, it's going to be rock solid at 24. Great. So let's change this one down. Change this back to. And then the second test was a shot from the Blender Studio's latest Sprite Fright short film. Awesome little film. If you get a chance to watch it, I would definitely recommend it. But this is a quite short little scene. So yeah, we've got viewport shading. In this case, Simplify is already at 0. That was how the file came. But yeah, let's play it and see what happens. Okay, we're getting about 21, 20 frames per second. It's a pretty heavy scene. What we could do though is we've got quite a heavy amount of information in this scene. So if I zoom in, you can see we've got quite a lot of set dressing with middle ground and background trees. So what we could do, if we have a look at which, here we go. See if we can turn off some of the trees, bushes, ferns, rocks, and then the set extension at the back. Okay, getting about 22 now. As an animator, you would generally be turning off a lot of elements to really concentrate on the performance. So in this case, by turning everything off, let's turn off quite a bit more. Here, there we go. Look. It's got less things to worry about, less things to render on screen, so you don't have to worry about distracting elements while you're animating. So now we're getting 24. Let's have a look, and if we join to this, yeah, now we're getting 24, rock solid, and we can just concentrate on the performance at this point. I could turn a few more things off, so I could turn off the lighting. I don't want to turn off these elements because this is part of the rig. So binoculars, a pencil, and notepad. But this would be all I would need if I was going to be animating it. And that's really, really encouraging. And if we bring everything back, start playing again. Yeah, we're getting about 20, 21. It's not too bad. Let's see. obviously this is Cycles, and the current version of Blender GPU rendering is not supported, or will be with version 3.1, hopefully coming soon. So this is going to be pointless to even start playing it, because as you can see, I turned on Cycles shading for the viewport. Starting to look great, but this is not going to, see, completely pointless, but it's a fun little distraction. Ooh. Go back to viewport shading. There we go. Let's close this down. Great. Okay, so I had a couple of different files there. The next thing I want to have a look at is bringing Alembic files. So one thing I've done in the past, doing lots of animating in Maya, but then bringing in Alembic files to Blender to do shading, lighting, and rendering. Alembic files are really useful, and they can be shared between different applications. So if you're going downstream in an animation pipeline, the lighting team would be working on Alembic files. So what I've got here, let's just open up Blender. I'm opening up version 3.0, just the beta. Let's get rid of these. So first thing I want to do is file, import Alembic, and then on my desktop, Alembic. I'm going to just reduce the scale as well, because they can come in really big, but also Maya works in a slightly different scale, works in centimeters. So by reducing it to about 0.2, it matches the internal Blender scale better that I found. So let's import. So there's no texture information or materials that get pulled over. It's purely just geometry. This is a shot I did recently. A really nice feature rig. Let's just split the viewport. And then, so in this case, there's no materials that's been brought over. So as soon as I start playing, it's going to hit 24 frames per second pretty easily. So let's close that up. And then, actually, let's bring that up now. So let's reopen Blender. And then there it is. So yeah, shot moved on a little bit further, did more, extended the set, built out a bunch of different flags for strategic lighting, which I'll come to in a second, and also worked on the texturing as well. So playing within the viewport, yeah, still absolutely fine. Rock solid at 24, which is really good. Let's just take this down as well. I didn't see the shaded. Don't see the shaded view. So again, I do have Simplify on. If I turn this off, drops down to 15, 16 frames per second, which is not super usable. But if we turn that back on, it's absolutely fine. So for this intents purposes, when you're working on it, adding Simplify really does help. So let's pause that, and then let's switch into Eevee. Let the materials load. Cool. And let's turn off. There we go. So yeah, so worked on the scene, textured it, lit it. Actually, let's bring it up in the second one so you can see. It's fairly smooth in terms of navigating around the scene. And if we hit play, getting about 9 frames per second, which is about what I expected. let's turn this one off. Yeah, we're getting about 17. And then if we switch over, oh, let's turn this back on. Getting about 11 frames per second. Wouldn't be good to animate to, but if you're working on just the scene itself, pretty handy. Cool. Okay, let's have a look at some other bits now. So let's have a look at the first Eevee scene. Okay, let's just have a look here. Just frame out past 2. So the scene is at 30 frames a second. So within viewport shading, yeah, absolutely fine. Let's switch to material preview. I think about 25, 24, 23. It's averaging about 26, 27. Averaging about 24, and then hitting 30 at the end. And then if we switch to Eevee, not a massive difference between material preview because it was already built within Eevee anyway. Getting about the same, averaging about 24, 25. That's not too bad. Okay, let's have a look at the Mr. Elephant scene. Okay, this is a pretty heavy scene, so the textures and everything might take a little bit. Just popped in. That's not too bad. Let's just reframe slightly. There's no animation on this one, so what we'll do is we'll create a split, and then we can have a look. So let's go into Eevee over here and turn off. There we go. So whilst it's on moving around, it's not too bad, but let's test it out and drop into Eevee here. Okay. Zoom in. I'm just going to hit spacebar and see what. Yeah. And then I wonder what. It's not too bad. Let's switch out. Let's see actually how long it might take to render this. So we've got ambient occlusion, bloom, volumetric lighting, volumetric shadows, simplify is off, screen space reflections. Output is 200% at 1080, so it's 2K. So let's have a look. Render image. I have to say, one of the things that's probably most impressive about this new machine is it's silent almost all the time. I mean, you can see from the TG Fan Pro in the menu bar, fan speed is about 1500, 1600 RPM at the moment, but I cannot hear it. I can hear the street outside more, and it's averaging, about 62%, and we're going back and forth between different scenes, and giving a different taxing. So it's really impressive. Okay, so that scene took 22 seconds to render, and used just over 2.5 gigs of memory. Nice. Cool, let's close this one up. Okay, next up, let's have a look at some geometry nodes stuff. So getting into a little bit more of an area where I'm not really au fait with it, but I wanted to show as many things as I could for people to get an idea of what is possible. So let's just get rid of the actual nodes for the moment, and we'll zoom in. So in this case, I'll just start playback, and we're getting about 13, almost 14 frames per second. This is set in Eevee, and if we just turn off the ambient occlusion, it stays about the same actually. And then if we turn on simplify with 0 subdivides, stays about the same. But let's have a look at interactivity. So let's just grab the ball, move it around, dropping about a frame, so it's about 13. Let's try a slightly different angle. Move it around a bit more. Get to see actually how the interactivity works on the geometry nodes themselves. It's only still about 12, 13 frames per second, and that was on viewport shading. Obviously, if we switch to Eevee, give it a second, and we just hit play. This is a heavy scene. This is here we go. Oh yeah, we're getting 3, almost 4 frames per second. Which isn't super usable. Switch back to viewport. Back to the camera. So yeah, so summing interactivity about half the frames per second. This is set to, oh, it's actually less than half. This is set to 30 frames a second, which isn't ideal, but okay, let's try a different one. Let's have a look at the cubic Whirlpool. Okay, so let's just hit play. Bring up the frames per second. Okay, so we're in material preview. Let's just switch straight to Eevee. Yeah, so we're getting a rock solid 24. What's really nice about this is we can now start in the modify stack over on the right. We can start changing some of the options, and it will automatically update within the viewport, and you can see the actual animation changing. This is a nice little scene because we've got quite a few things moving around, plus some depth of field. Nice. Let's also find this a frame. Yeah, this is a good frame because we've got some real sharp elements on the left, some really out of focus elements in the center of the frame. So we've got Eevee, and let's just do a quick render. See how this goes. Oh wow! So 1.3 seconds. Cool. So let's have a look at next one. Let's have a look at the procedural buildings. This is a sweet little scene. So we've got 3 different buildings, and over in the modifier stack we've got a number of elements to be able to change it. So for example, we can change the width, we can change the height. But if we then click on this building or this building. Same options to change, but obviously slightly different. There's no animation, but I'm just going to play this to be able to get a reading. So when we start moving things around, you can see the playback. Let's add some elements onto this one. Maybe come down and change some of the window information. And what we can do as well, if we go to the scene, zoom out, and then start changing these a bit differently with a slightly different view. So we get a variable frame rate dependent on how much is actually in the frame, but also how much is actually being changed. That's interesting. What we could do, which could be a nice little test, is we've got our sun lamp here, and if we go back to frame 1, hit I, and let's set a rotational keyframe, and then if we have a look and change, go to the end, set another rotational keyframe which is the same, go roughly in the middle, and if we change the direction, hit I, add another rotational keyframe, we should get a nice slowly moving sunlight. Just so we've got some rotational information happening as well as everything else. So let's go back and have a look at these. Going to change these up a bit. Further changes. Now that we've got less geometry in the scene, we've got a frames per second of 24, but as we start to add more geometry, it starts to drop down. If we went mad and we just change the height to 100 for all of them. So now we've got a hell of a lot of geometry in the scene. I can see frame rate has dropped to about 5 frames a second. And if we try to move about in the viewport, it's not really usable. But if we switch to viewport rendering, add a little bit more interactivity. But let's take all these down again. And now it's perfectly usable. Switch to Eevee. Oh, it's actually cycles. We've got, where's denoising? Let's do open image denoising instead. Now it's just constantly updating because I've got frame rate information in there, so that it's got sunlight information in there. But if we start to move around, give it a chance to catch up, switch back to the camera. Not sure this is going to be set up for Eevee, but it might be an interesting thing to play with. Okay, that's actually not too bad. Zoom in and out. Let's change these up. Let's give it. About 6 frames a second. So that's working in Eevee. But let's turn off ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, and we'll put simplify on. Take that down to 0. If we can get this running any better. Yeah, it's still about 5 or 6 frames a second. But then of course, if we take these back down again. Cool, so that's some geometry node stuff. Some modeling demos. So this is an interesting one. This is the curve bevel profile modifier. A really ornate mirror. So it loads straight in to viewport with material preview. And you can see over on the right, we've got the profile of the mirror parts. So if we have a look, I've got a few elements. So there's the actual inner frame, there's the mirror itself, and then there's the ornaments on the outside. So there's the lower and the upper part. The lower and the upper have the same profile, and then the inner frame has a slightly different profile. So what we can do, let's just choose the lower ornament so we can see it, and then we can grab the points on the actual bevel curve, and it will change after a very small update. And if we hold down Control and click on that line, we can then add in some more points as well. And let's have a look at Eevee with some more lighting information. And let's see how much we can change this around. Updates after a very quick delay. And then if we just move around viewport, it's pretty responsive, getting about 16-17 frames per second. And if we zoom right in, let's see how this looks when we change the it will update as we're working. And if we switch to viewport rendering, again updates after a small delay, but the responsiveness is around 25 frames per second. It's really really nice and smooth. Cool. Let's have a look at some of the simulations. Cool, okay, so we've got the little demo file up. Is it play? It's getting 25 frames per second, which I believe, yep, that's the file set. Let's navigate around, go into both. Slightly harder to see because it's white against white, but yeah, getting 25 pretty much on both, which is cool. Nice. Okay, let's now have a look at the fluid simulation. Let's open this up in 3.0. So, a few different things here. We have to bake the simulation first, see how long it takes, and then we can have a look at the playback speed of that simulation after it's done. So the entire thing is 250 frames. So if we go into the physics tab with the domain selected, so we scroll down, we've got the cache setting and we can bake everything. So at 1, let's just change back to solid and let's hit bake. Okay, so the baking is done. Let's hit play. So we're in solid view at the moment, getting about 11 frames a second. Let's just frame this a little bit better so you can see it. And if we switch to rendered view, it drops to about 10, 11, depending on how much geometry is on show. Back to solid, picks up a little bit. So if we free all, change the simulation method to flip, then bake again. Okay, so that's that one done. It's getting about 10, 11 frames per second in viewport shading. Switch to rendered, dropping to about 8 or 9. Now there is every possibility I might have done this slightly wrong, but I think I followed it through. But if anyone has any insights to doing more simulation work, would love to hear it. Okay. Okay, next up, we're going to have a look at the lava fluid viscosity demo. Okay, so for this one we have to do 2 baking. We have to bake the domain and the mesh. First one being the domain, and then it allows us to bake the mesh. So over in the physics panel, we've got the domain, bake data, and then you can see you've got the mesh down here, but it won't allow us to do it until we've done the domain. So let's do that first. Okay, so that's the first one done. Scroll down, you can then bake the mesh. So now if we hit play, so in viewport shading, getting 24 frames per second. And obviously this is with cycles. So as soon as we switch to material preview, we're going to just get a dramatic drop. And if we go to rendered, we're going to get better frames per second, but it's just constantly just trying to update itself. But let's pause it on that frame. Cool, and done. So it took just over 2 minutes to render that frame. CPU hit about 90 degrees, but the fan only stayed around 1600 RPM, and it's basically silent. It's pretty warm now on my lap, but we have been here for quite a while recording these tests, but that's fine. What'll be really interesting is when GPU rendering comes in with version 3.1 and metal support, see what increase in rendering speed that does. I'm guessing quite a bit. Cool, let's close this down. Great, so that's some of the simulation stuff that I wanted to have a look at. Some grease pencil files. Again, there's another area that I'm not totally au fait with, but I wanted to show this as well. Of course, we've got a nice little scene here. Let's just hit play. We have two cameras running at the same time. And let's bring up the frames per second so we can see. So we're getting about 23, almost 24, and we have 3 viewports open at the same time. So if we actually reduce this one down, see if that makes a difference. Interestingly, I actually dropped a couple of frames by doing it that way. Let's bring that back. Could also be the actual file itself. It was had less geometry on screen. So let's have a look at the other one. Okay, it's just a single scene here. Cool, okay. So we're getting about 20, 21 frames per second. Obviously we've got the main viewport window up here. So if we just came into here, we're getting 24. Getting 24 fine, and then come back. So we've got a few different elements here. So let's say we wanted to just concentrate on our main character in the center. So here's the queen over here. If we take everything else off, hit play. Yeah, there we go. Now we've got 24 frames per second playback. And we could even turn the background off as well. And let's start bringing some of these back. Let's start bringing some of these back. So we've got the secondary characters and the extras. And then bring some more. Still at 24. Let's bring back some more people. Oh, just dipping now. And then obviously if we bring back the remainder, yeah, now we dip down back to where we were before at 21. Cool. Splash screens. Some of these are Eevee and some of these are geometry. I just had them separated here because they've separated on the demo files website. So first things first, let's have a look at the junk shop, and let's open this up in Blender 3.0. Okay. Again, there's no animation on this one. So what we will do is set for cycles. So let's change this to CPU, and then we will turn on viewport denoising. Let's do open image denoise. Switch to cycles in the viewport. Give it a second to load up all the textures. As you can see, it's starting to resolve itself automatically. But I didn't want to do any rendering at this point. What I actually wanted to have a look at was how responsive it is when we are moving around the viewport, just so we can see how responsive this is. It's pretty good. If we turn off viewport denoising, let's turn viewport denoising back on. If we change to automatic, see if that makes a difference. Doesn't look so. Doesn't look like it, but I believe that's because Optrix is CUDA based, so it's not going to be using that. Okay, so let's go back to viewport shading. So we've got cycles, CPU, and then see here we've got noise for the render already set. So if we go to render image, so that took 1 minute 13 seconds. Let's have a look and see if this makes a difference doing it in 2.93. So switch to CPU, supported. Let's change the tile size. Render image. There we go, it took 1 minute 18 seconds. Not bad. Cool. Monster under the bed. So this scene is to really test out the subsurface scattering on the monster under the bed, hence the title. You can see in the bottom part we've got a pre-rendered image as a reference. So if we just pop the statistics open, and let's pop into the camera. So yes, so let's change to CPU, and we're in Blender 3.0, so it'll be a progressive render. At the moment, the Mac version of Cycles is CPU, not GPU. So these tests are really going to be just a quick snapshot of what it's like, as opposed to the benchmarks that everyone else is doing, because they're not really applicable, because Cycles really wants to use the GPU and we just don't have that facility yet. Okay, now let's have a look at some instancing. Just a good way to get an idea of the total amount of geometry the scene can handle, but also the difference between duplicating and instancing. So the file I've got here is the Ghost Trap from Ghostbusters, which I modeled in Maya. Let's just quickly shade smooth. So object itself is 52,000 vertices, 55,000 faces. So if we start duplicating this, you can see that the total amount of geometry in the scene is going up. So let's see what we can get to. Okay. So we're now pushing 7 million faces. Let's keep going. Ooh. Hasn't slowed down yet, which is good. Let's do a big amount here. Slight pause there while it copied everything. Okay, not looking too bad. This is quite surprising actually, considering it's duplicated. Okay, now it's really starting to think about it. So here we've got 74 million faces. Navigating around, still pretty responsive. It's really only the selection and then the moving part that is taking a bit more time. I guess it has to hold all this information in memory. Yeah, we're pushing 44 gigs. There we go. Let's just, 50 gigs. Heavy memory usage swap is probably starting to be used here. Yeah, 148 million faces. Okay, let's quit. And this time, let's have a look at instancing. So we do the same thing, bring in our object. So the first thing we're going to do is over here in the outliner, we've got our object, which is in one collection. So let's call this Ghost Trap 001. And then hide it from View, go to the Add menu, Instant Collection. So over in the outliner, we've got a instance of the previous collection. You can tell it's slightly different because it has dual collection icons and they're also orange, but exactly the same amount of faces and everything else. So when we start to duplicate this now, so we've got 3, but it's stayed exactly the same in terms of the amount of geometry in the scene, because all the Blender's doing is it's holding the information of the main collection in memory and then instancing these as opposed to physically or virtually duplicating them. So let's see. How far we can get this time. I think the others were a little bit more tightly packed, but that doesn't matter for the moment. Okay, slight slow down the selection process there, but nothing too bad. Now obviously it's harder to measure how much geometry is in the scene because obviously it's instancing everything as opposed to duplicating, but we'll still get some slowdown. Definitely got more geometry in the scene now. So you'll notice up in the menu bar, it's only using 6.5 gigs of RAM, whereas before it was exponentially getting bigger and it crashed out at about 50 gigs used. But CPU usage is actually quite small as well in comparison. Temperatures are about 63 degrees and the fan's at 1500, but I basically can't hear it. So let's continue. Okay, starting a bit of a slow down now. Let's do it this way. Select all. Bit of a slow down. So, how many collections do we have in the scene? Okay, so if we look over here, 11,520. That's the count, which is pretty impressive. Okay, we're starting to chug a little bit now in terms of selection. Let's just see if we can get one more. See, we're getting a bit of slowdown on pie menus. Yeah, definitely getting a bit slow down now. Oh, here we go. Oh yeah, it's definitely slowing down. Hasn't crashed out yet though, hasn't used any swap. Well, I guess it wouldn't if it's only used just under 7 gig. It's definitely trying. It's a bit unresponsive. There we go, okay. So it's 33,801. So if we do 33,801 times by, let's just do the faces, 55, 133. So that is 1,863,550,533 faces, which is pretty insane. I don't think I need to go any further really, which is quite interesting. Okay, so last up, this is a file I've got from the Blender Artist Forum, user Renzatic. It's like Eevee test. So let's have a look. 831,000 faces. It did just say it's not optimized, so we can just hit render in Eevee and see how long it takes. But before we do that, let's have a look at how the scene is set up. So as you can see, it's a really heavy, dense scene. So viewport playback is okay. It's a little bit jittery. Just hit play just so we can get a frames per second counter up. Getting about 1.8, 1.9 frames per second moving around in the viewport. Okay, let's pause that. Come back. Let's rejoin and then let's render image. Okay, we are done, and that took 2 minutes 55 seconds and used about 1.5 gigs of memory. It's a lovely looking scene as well. Nice work, Renzatic. Cool. So I hope that was helpful. I know it was really helpful for me to see what this computer can do. I tried to show as many areas as I could. Some areas that I had knowledge of, some areas that I didn't have knowledge of, but it was fun to do. Cool. See ya.